The day my daughter tried to put me in a nursing home started like any other Tuesday. The sun filtered through the kitchen window, painting golden squares across the old oak table, where I had eaten breakfast every morning for nearly 40 years. I sat there with my coffee, watching birds gather near the feeder outside, completely unaware that my life was about to change. At 72, I wasn't rich. I wasn't famous. I wasn't even particularly remarkable. I was just a widow named Margaret who had spent most of her life taking care of everyone else. My husband, Robert, had passed away 6 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. The loss had nearly destroyed me. For 50 years, we had built a life together inside that little blue house on Maple Street. Every wall held a memory. Every room carried a piece of our story. After he died, people kept asking if I planned to move. I never understood why. The house wasn't just a building. It was home, and besides, I managed perfectly well on my own. I paid my bills. I cooked my meals. I maintained the garden Robert had loved so much. Sure, my knees hurt sometimes, and I occasionally forgot where I left my reading glasses, but who didn't? Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine. At exactly 10:30 that morning, my daughter Jennifer arrived unannounced. That wasn't unusual. Jennifer had always been spontaneous. What was unusual was the expression on her face. She looked nervous. The moment she walked through the door, I felt something wasn't right. "Mom," she said, forcing a smile. "Can we talk?" Those 4 words rarely lead anywhere good. I invited her into the kitchen and poured her a cup of coffee. She barely touched it. Instead, she kept glancing around the room as though searching for the right place to begin. Finally, she took a deep breath. "Mom, I've been worried about you." I laughed softly. "Worried? Why? You're alone here." "I've been alone for 6 years. I know, but you're getting older." There it was, that sentence. The one older people hear all the time. You're getting older. As though age suddenly makes you incapable of thinking. As though every birthday steals a piece of your independence. I set my coffee mug down carefully, and Jennifer shifted in her chair. "I just think it might be time to start considering other options." Other options? You know, someplace with more support. The room suddenly felt colder. I knew exactly where the conversation was headed. I just couldn't believe she was actually saying it. "You mean a nursing home?" Jennifer quickly raised her hands. No, not like that." "Then what exactly do you mean?" "One of those senior communities. A nice place. Activities. Medical staff nearby. Friends your age. Friends my age." As though all my friends magically lived inside one building. As though the life I had built meant nothing. I stared at my daughter. The same little girl whose scraped knees I had bandaged. The same child I had worked double shifts to support after her father lost his job years ago. The same daughter whose college tuition Robert and I had sacrificed vacations to pay. And now she was sitting across from me suggesting I leave my home. My home. The place I had spent decades creating. "Jennifer," I said quietly, "did something happen?" "What do you mean? Why now?" She hesitated. Only for a second. But I noticed. A mother always notices. "No reason," she replied. That was my first clue. Because whenever someone says, "no reason," there's usually a very big reason. The conversation ended awkwardly. Jennifer changed the subject. We talked about the weather, her children, a new restaurant that had opened downtown. But neither of us could forget what had just been said. When she left that afternoon, she hugged me tightly. Too tightly. Almost as though she felt guilty. I stood at the front door and watched her drive away. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. The next few weeks only made that feeling stronger. Jennifer started calling more often. At first, I appreciated it. Then I noticed a pattern. Every conversation somehow returned to the same topic. Safety, health, assistance, senior living. One afternoon, she even mailed me brochures. Brochures. Glossy photographs showing smiling elderly people playing bingo and gardening together. As though a few stock photos would convince me to abandon everything I loved. I threw them in a drawer. But the more she pushed, the more suspicious I became. Jennifer wasn't acting like a concerned daughter. She was acting like someone trying to accomplish a goal. The question was why. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It happened on a rainy Thursday evening. I had just finished dinner when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Jennifer's name. When I answered, I expected another conversation about senior living. Instead, I heard panic. "Mom, are you okay?" "Of course. You didn't answer your phone earlier." "I was gardening." There was silence. Then she sighed dramatically. "You scared me." That seemed strange, because I had only missed one call. One. Yet she sounded as though I had disappeared for days. And then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "What if something happened to you and nobody knew?" The sentence sounded rehearsed, prepared, like part of a script. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I listened. People often reveal more when they're filling silence. Sure enough, Jennifer kept talking. "That's exactly why you need to think seriously about moving somewhere safer." There it was again. Always the same destination, no matter where the conversation started. For the first time, I began wondering whether this had anything to do with me at all. That thought stayed with me long after the call ended. The following week, I received an unexpected visitor, my neighbor Helen. Helen had lived next door for 20 years and knew everyone on the street. Nothing escaped her attention. She arrived carrying a pie and an expression I couldn't quite read. After settling into the kitchen, she leaned closer. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Is everything all right between you and Jennifer?" My heart skipped. "Why?" Helen hesitated. Then she spoke words that would change everything. I wasn't sure whether I should mention it. "Mention what?" "I saw Jennifer." "Okay. She wasn't alone." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Helen took a deep breath. "Last week, she met with a real estate agent." The room went silent. I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "A real estate agent?" Helen nodded slowly. "Right outside your house." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My daughter, meeting with a real estate agent, outside my house, a house she had been trying desperately to convince me to leave. Suddenly, every conversation, every brochure, every concerned phone call began fitting together like pieces of a puzzle. And I didn't like the picture they were creating. Not one bit. That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every interaction from the past several months. The pressure, the guilt, the urgency, the rehearsed concern. For the first time in my life, I found myself asking a question I never imagined I would ask. Was my daughter trying to help me, or was she trying to get me out of the way? And as rain tapped softly against the windows of the house Robert and I had built together, a terrible realization began forming in my mind. If Jennifer thought she could quietly push me into a nursing home and take control of my future, she was about to discover she had seriously underestimated her mother. I didn't tell Jennifer what Helen had told me, not immediately. In fact, for the next several days, I acted as though nothing had changed. I answered her calls. I listened politely when she brought up senior communities. I even thanked her for the brochures she kept sending. If Jennifer noticed anything different, she didn't show it. But behind the scenes, I was paying attention in a way I never had before. The truth is, when someone betrays your trust, or even gives you reason to suspect they might, you start seeing things differently. Conversations that once seemed harmless suddenly feel calculated. Small details become impossible to ignore, and every word gets weighed a little more carefully. 3 days after Helen's visit, Jennifer invited me to lunch. Normally, I would have been happy to go. This time, however, I was curious, very curious. The restaurant was crowded when I arrived. Jennifer was already seated. She greeted me warmly and immediately ordered my favorite tea before I even sat down. A thoughtful gesture, or perhaps an attempt to keep me comfortable. The conversation started normally enough. The grandchildren, the weather, her husband Brian, and his latest work project, but eventually she steered things exactly where I expected. "Mom," she said carefully, "have you thought any more about what we discussed?" I smiled. "What part?" "The living arrangements." There it was. Again, always the same subject. I stirred my tea slowly. "Why is this so important to you?" Jennifer froze. Just for a second. But it was enough. "I already told you. I know what you told me." She shifted in her seat. "I'm worried about you." I looked directly into her eyes. "When did you become so worried?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. "What do you mean? You weren't worried last year. That's not fair. You weren't worried 6 months ago either." Her expression tightened. I could almost see her searching for the right answer, the convincing answer, the answer that would make me stop asking questions. Before she could find it, The waitress arrived with our food. The interruption saved her. But it also confirmed something important. Jennifer wasn't being honest. The rest of lunch felt uncomfortable. Forced. By the time we said goodbye in the parking lot, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening, I wasn't getting the full story. That evening, I made a decision. For the first time in my life, I was going to investigate my own daughter. The very idea broke my heart. Parents spend decades protecting their children, trusting them, believing in them. You never imagine a day will come when you feel the need to look behind the curtain. But sometimes the truth demands uncomfortable choices. The next morning, I started with something simple: my finances. If Jennifer thought I was becoming incapable of managing my affairs, I wanted proof that she was wrong. I gathered every document I could find: bank statements, tax records, investment accounts, insurance papers, everything. Hours passed as I organized files across the dining room table. By sunset, one thing was clear. My finances were in excellent shape. Better than excellent, actually. Robert and I had always been careful. We saved when others spent, invested when others borrowed. The result was a comfortable retirement and a house that had been fully paid off for nearly 15 years. That realization led me to another thought, a thought I didn't want to consider: the house. The house was valuable, very valuable. Property prices in our neighborhood had skyrocketed over the past decade. Several homes nearby had recently sold for amounts that would have shocked Robert and me years ago. I walked through each room that evening: the living room where we had celebrated birthdays, the kitchen where countless family dinners had taken place, the hallway where Jennifer had measured her height as a child, the bedroom where Robert had held my hand during his final days. Every corner carried memories. But to a real estate agent, to a buyer, to someone thinking purely in financial terms, it was an asset, a very valuable asset. The possibility made my stomach twist. Surely Jennifer wasn't thinking that way. Surely not. Yet the doubt remained. The following week brought another surprise. A letter arrived from my attorney. At first I assumed it was routine paperwork. Instead, it contained something unexpected. A notice informing me that someone had recently inquired about the status of my estate planning. Documents. I read the letter twice. Then, a third time. Someone had requested information. Not details. Not access. Just confirmation that documents existed and whether they were current. My hands trembled slightly as I picked up the phone. I called my attorney immediately. After exchanging greetings, I got straight to the point. Who made the inquiry? There was a brief pause. I'm not sure I should disclose that. Please. Another pause. Then a sigh. It was your daughter. The room suddenly felt smaller. Jennifer? Yes. Recently. About 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Right around the same time the brochures had started arriving. Right around the same time the pressure had intensified. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat in silence, trying to make sense of everything. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe Jennifer was simply preparing for emergencies. Maybe she was being responsible. Maybe, but the timing felt impossible to ignore. That evening, something happened that pushed my concerns to an entirely different level. I was returning from the grocery store when I noticed a black SUV parked across the street from my house. At first I paid little attention. Then I saw 2 people standing near the curb. One was Jennifer. The other was a man holding a clipboard. My heart immediately began racing. I slowed my car and watched from a distance. The man pointed toward my house. Jennifer nodded. Then they walked a few steps closer to the property. Closer, as though examining it, evaluating it, studying it. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I knew enough. The moment Jennifer spotted my car, her expression changed completely. Surprise, then panic. The man quickly stepped back. Jennifer forced a smile. I parked and climbed out slowly. "What are you doing here?" I asked. "Mom," she laughed nervously. "What a coincidence." Coincidence. I nearly laughed myself. The man introduced himself. His name was Stephen. He claimed to be helping Jennifer evaluate neighborhood property values for a future investment. The explanation sounded rehearsed, almost identical to the concern she had shown during previous conversations. Prepared, polished, convenient, too convenient. After a few minutes, Stephen left. Jennifer stayed behind. For a moment, we simply stood there looking at each other, neither speaking. neither fully trusting the other. Finally, she broke the silence. "You don't seem happy to see me." I looked at her carefully. "I don't know what I'm seeing anymore." The words hit harder than I intended. Her face fell. For an instant, genuine hurt appeared in her eyes, and that made everything even more confusing. Because despite all my suspicions, I still loved my daughter. Desperately. Part of me wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding, that all of this could be explained, that families didn't fall apart this way. But another part of me, the part that had spent weeks watching patterns emerge, knew better. Something was happening, and I was running out of time to discover what it was. That night, I pulled out an old notebook Robert had once used. Inside were pages filled with observations about investments, household expenses, and future plans. One sentence caught my attention, a sentence written years before his death. "If people ever underestimate you, let them. Knowledge is stronger than argument." I stared at those words for a long time. Then I smiled, for the first time in weeks, because I suddenly realized something important. I didn't need to confront Jennifer yet. I didn't need accusations. I didn't need arguments. What I needed was information, facts, proof. And if there was one thing Robert had taught me, it was patience. So I made another decision, a bigger one. The next morning, I scheduled a private meeting with both my attorney and financial advisor. If people were making plans involving my future, they were about to discover that I still controlled every piece of it. And before this was over, I intended to learn exactly why my daughter seemed so determined to remove me from the home I loved, even if the answer shattered my heart, because deep down, I could feel the truth getting closer. And something told me that when it finally arrived, it would be far worse than I had imagined. The following Monday, I walked into my attorney's office carrying more questions than answers. For nearly 30 years, David Reynolds had handled every major legal matter for Robert and me. He had helped us buy the house, establish our wills, organize our retirement plans, and navigate countless decisions over the years. More importantly, he was someone I trusted. As I settled into the chair across from his desk, David immediately sensed something was wrong. "Margaret," he said gently, "what's happened?" For a moment, I struggled to answer, not because I didn't know what to say, but because speaking the words aloud somehow made them feel more real. "I think my daughter is hiding something from me." The sentence hung in the air. David remained silent, allowing me to continue. So I told him everything: the brochures, the constant conversations about nursing homes, the real estate agent, the inquiry about my estate, every detail. When I finished, David leaned back thoughtfully. "I understand why you're concerned. Am I overreacting?" He shook his head. "No." The answer came quickly. Too quickly. My stomach tightened. "Why do you say that?" "Because people generally don't take this many steps unless they've wife. These were working toward a specific objective." I looked down at my hands. Part of me had hoped he would laugh, tell me I was imagining things, explain away every concern. Instead, he had just confirmed what I already feared. David opened a folder and slid several papers across the desk. "These are your current documents." I reviewed them carefully. Everything appeared exactly as Robert and I had arranged years ago. The house remained solely in my name. My assets were secure. My decision-making authority remained completely intact. No one could legally force me into a nursing facility. No one could sell my property. No one could make financial decisions on my behalf, not without my consent. The realization brought some relief, but only some, because legal protection couldn't answer the question that mattered most. Why was Jennifer doing this? After meeting with David, I headed directly to my financial advisor's office. The discussion there proved equally eye-opening. According to current estimates, my home alone had nearly tripled in value over the previous decade. When combined with my savings and investments, my estate was worth considerably more than I had realized. I sat quietly as numbers appeared on the screen. Numbers that represented decades of hard work, decades of sacrifice, decades of careful planning. And suddenly, a thought entered my mind that I desperately wished had never appeared. What if this wasn't about my safety? What if it was about my assets? The possibility made me physically ill. No parent wants to believe their child could be motivated by money, especially not a child they spent their entire life loving. Yet the question refused to leave. That evening, I returned home exhausted. emotionally drained. I made myself a simple dinner but barely touched it. Instead, I found myself sitting on the back porch as darkness settled across the neighborhood. The garden swayed gently in the evening breeze. The same garden Robert and I had planted together years ago. Every flower carried a memory. Every tree told a story. As I sat there, my phone rang. Jennifer. For several seconds, I considered ignoring the call. Eventually, I answered. "Hi, Mom." Her voice sounded cheerful. Too cheerful. "Hello. How was your day?" "Busy." "Doing what?" A simple question. Yet something about the way she asked it immediately caught my attention. She sounded curious, almost investigative. I chose my words carefully. "Just running errands." "I see." There was a brief silence. Then she cleared her throat. "Actually, Brian and I wanted to talk to you about something." My instincts immediately went on alert. "What is it?" "We were wondering if we could stop by tomorrow." "Why?" Another pause. "Just to talk. Just to talk." I had learned to distrust those words. Still, I agreed. The next afternoon, Jennifer arrived with her husband. The moment they stepped inside, I sensed tension. Brian rarely involved himself in family matters. Normally he stayed quiet and let Jennifer lead conversations. Today was different. Today he looked nervous. The three of us sat around the kitchen table. For several minutes, nobody spoke. Finally, Jennifer placed a folder on the table. My heart immediately began pounding. "What is that?" I asked. "It's information." "Information about what?" She slid the folder toward me. Slowly, carefully, I opened it. Inside were photographs, brochures, financial comparisons, facility descriptions, everything related to senior living communities. Again, I stared at the papers, then looked up at my daughter. "You brought this here? We just want you to consider your options." My patience finally began wearing thin. "I have considered my options, not seriously." The words hit harder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as she intended. I pushed the folder aside. "I'm not moving." Jennifer's expression hardened. Something changed in her eyes. For weeks, she had been pretending, being gentle, being careful. Now the frustration was showing. "Mom, you're being stubborn." "No, you're refusing to face reality." I stared at her. Reality? I lived independently, managed my finances, maintained my property, drove myself everywhere. What reality was I supposedly refusing to face? Brian finally spoke. "Maybe we should calm down." Neither of us listened, because years of unspoken tension were suddenly bubbling to the surface. "What exactly is your concern?" I asked. Jennifer crossed her arms. "You want the truth?" "Yes." "Fine." Her voice rose. "You're getting older." There it was again, the phrase I had grown to hate, but this time she continued. "What happens if you fall? What happens if you get sick? What happens if nobody finds you?" The questions came rapidly, emotionally, almost desperately. Yet something felt wrong, because underneath her concern, I sensed fear. Not fear for me, fear of something else, something she wasn't saying. And then, unexpectedly, Brian spoke again. "Jennifer." His tone carried a warning. She ignored him. "Mom, this house is too much for one person." My eyes narrowed. "This house?" The moment the words left my mouth, both of them froze. Just briefly, but long enough. Long enough for me to notice, and long enough for my suspicions to grow stronger. I leaned forward. "What about the house?" Nobody answered. The silence told me everything. For several uncomfortable seconds, the room remained completely still. Then Jennifer looked away. That single action felt more revealing than any confession. Because guilty people often avoid eye contact when the truth gets too close. Finally, she stood. "We're only trying to help." I rose as well. "Then tell me the truth." Her eyes widened. "The truth about what?" "The real reason you're pushing so hard." Neither she nor Brian responded. Instead, they gathered their things and headed toward the door. The conversation was over, or so they thought. Because after they left, something happened that changed everything. An hour later, my phone buzzed. A text message. Not from Jennifer, from Brian. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The message contained only one sentence that instantly sent chills down my spine. "We need to talk privately. Jennifer can't know." I read it 3 times, then 4. My heart hammered against my chest, because whatever secrets existed, Brian clearly knew them. And judging by that message, he was finally ready to talk. I responded immediately. When? His reply arrived less than 30 seconds later. Tomorrow morning. Please. Please. Not if you want. Not when you're available. Please. The urgency in that single word terrified me, because people don't send secret messages behind their spouse back unless something serious is happening. Very serious. That night, sleep became impossible. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, thinking about every clue, every conversation, every suspicious coincidence. The real estate agent, the estate inquiry, the pressure, the brochures, the house. And now, Brian secretly asking to meet. Deep down, I knew tomorrow would bring answers. The only question was whether I was ready to hear them, because after weeks of uncertainty, the truth was finally approaching. And something told me that once Brian started talking, nothing in my family would ever be the same again. The next morning, I arrived at the small cafe 20 minutes early. I barely slept the night before. Every possible explanation had raced through my mind. Maybe Brian wanted to reassure me. Maybe he wanted to apologize for the argument. Maybe he had information that would finally explain Jennifer's behavior. Or maybe the truth was far worse than anything I had imagined. By the time Brian walked through the cafe doors, my nerves were stretched thin. The moment I saw his face, I knew something was wrong. Very wrong. He looked exhausted, the kind of exhausted that comes from carrying a burden too heavy for too long. He spotted me near the window and slowly approached. For several seconds after sitting down, he didn't speak. Neither did I. Finally, he exhaled heavily. Margaret, before I say anything, I need you to know something. I remained silent. I never wanted things to reach this point. My stomach tightened. What point? Brian looked around to ensure nobody was listening. Then he lowered his voice. The point where I'm sitting here having this conversation. A cold feeling spread through my chest. Just tell me what's going on. He rubbed his forehead, as though the words physically hurt. Then he finally said them. Jennifer and I are in serious financial trouble. For a moment, I wasn't sure I had heard correctly. Financial trouble? That wasn't what I expected. Not even close. What kind of trouble? Brian's eyes dropped toward the table. The kind that keeps you awake at night. I stared at him, waiting. Eventually, he continued. A few years ago, I invested in a business opportunity. The way he said it immediately worried me. Whenever people use the phrase business opportunity, disaster usually follows. It failed. I nodded slowly. Okay. No. You don't understand. His voice cracked. It didn't just fail. He swallowed hard. It destroyed us. The cafe suddenly seemed very quiet. Too quiet. Brian explained everything. The investment, the loans, the refinancing, the debt. One mistake had led to another, then another, and another, like dominoes falling. Before long, they found themselves trapped beneath obligations they couldn't escape. I listened carefully, trying to process each detail. The amount of money involved shocked me, not because it was impossible, but because I had no idea things had become so bad. Jennifer never told me. Brian laughed bitterly. She didn't want anyone to know. That sounded exactly like my daughter. Proud, independent, determined to solve her own problems, even when those problems became impossible. What does this have to do with me? The question lingered between us. Brian looked away, then back at me, and finally he answered, everything. My pulse quickened. He reached into his briefcase and removed several documents. I immediately recognized one of them, a neighborhood property report, the same type of report the man with the clipboard had been carrying outside my house. Brian slid the papers across the table. I didn't touch them. Not yet, because suddenly I wasn't sure I wanted to know. But eventually, I forced myself to look. Property values, market estimates, projected sale figures, potential proceeds. Every document focused on one thing, my house, my beloved home, the home Robert and I had built together, the home Jennifer wanted me to leave. The realization hit like a punch to the chest. I looked up slowly. Tell me. Brian closed his eyes briefly. Then he spoke the words I had been fearing for weeks. Jennifer believes selling your house could solve our financial problems. The world seemed to stop. Not literally, but that's how it felt. As though every sound around me had suddenly disappeared. As though time itself had paused. I stared at him, unable to speak, unable to breathe properly, unable to comprehend what I had just heard. My house? Brian nodded. Tears filled his eyes. Yes, I felt something break inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something deeper, something sadder. Because in that moment, I wasn't thinking about money. I wasn't thinking about real estate. I wasn't even thinking about betrayal. I was thinking about Jennifer as a little girl, running through the backyard, laughing while Robert pushed her on a swing, falling asleep on my shoulder during long car rides. How had we arrived here? How had we gone from those memories to this conversation? Brian continued speaking, but his voice sounded distant, almost muffled, like I was hearing it through water. At first she only talked about future possibilities. He paused. Then the debts got worse. I forced myself to focus. What happened then? She became desperate. The word hung heavily between us. Desperate. Desperate people often convince themselves that bad decisions are reasonable, necessary, even justified. Brian leaned forward. Margaret, I need you to understand something. I met his eyes. Jennifer doesn't think she's hurting you. I almost laughed. The irony was unbelievable. Then what does she think she's doing? Saving her family. There it was. The twisted logic behind everything. The pressure, the manipulation, the nursing home discussions, the concern, the urgency. In Jennifer's mind, she wasn't taking something from me. She was rescuing her husband, protecting her children, saving her future. The problem was that her solution required sacrificing mine, and somewhere along the way, she had convinced herself that was acceptable. I sat silently for several moments. Then another question entered my mind. A question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. How far was she willing to go? Brian's expression immediately changed. That alone frightened me, because people don't look guilty unless they know something troubling. Brian, he hesitated. Answer me. Finally, he nodded. There was a plan. The words sent chills through my body. A plan? He looked miserable. She wanted you to move voluntarily, and if I refused? His silence answered before he did. My stomach dropped. Brian. His voice barely rose above a whisper. Then she planned to pursue legal guardianship. The cafe disappeared around me. Everything else vanished. All I could hear were those two words. Legal guardianship. I knew exactly what they meant. A court proceeding. An attempt to declare someone incapable of managing their own affairs. An effort to transfer control. Control over finances. Control over decisions. Control over property. Control over life itself. I stared at Brian in disbelief. She wanted a court to declare me incompetent? Tears appeared in his eyes. I tried to stop her. For several seconds I couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't move. The betrayal felt unimaginable. Not because of the money. Money comes and goes, but because of what it represented. My daughter had looked at me, not as her mother, but as an obstacle standing between her and a solution. And that realization hurt more than anything else. Brian slid one final document across the table. A legal consultation invoice, dated 2 weeks earlier. My hands trembled as I examined it. The evidence was undeniable. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't suspicion. This was real. Painfully real. I looked out the cafe window. The world continued moving. Cars passed. People walked. Life went on. Yet everything inside me had changed. Because now I finally understood the truth. The nursing home had never been the goal. The house had. And my daughter had been willing to take extraordinary steps to get it. Brian eventually spoke again. There's something else. I turned toward him slowly. What? His expression darkened. The fear in his eyes instantly alarmed me. Because if everything he'd already revealed wasn't the worst part, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what came next. He swallowed hard, then said the words that would change everything. Jennifer doesn't know this yet, but someone else is involved. I frowned. What do you mean? Brian's face turned pale. The people she owes money to aren't willing to wait anymore. A cold wave of dread washed over me, because suddenly, this wasn't just about family betrayal. It was becoming something much bigger, something far more dangerous. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized that both Jennifer and I might be standing in the path of a disaster neither of us saw coming. For the rest of that day, I walked through my house in a daze, not because I didn't understand what Brian had told me, but because I understood it too well. Every room suddenly felt different. The photographs on the walls, the furniture Robert and I had chosen together, The worn staircase where Jennifer used to slide down as a child despite my constant warnings. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same anymore. Because now I knew something I could never unknow. My daughter had not been trying to save me. She had been trying to save herself. And somehow, that realization hurt even more than the deception itself. Late that evening, I sat alone in the living room holding an old photo album. One picture after another carried me back through the years. Jennifer's first day of school, family vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings, a lifetime of memories. I stopped at a photograph taken shortly after Robert and I bought the house. We were standing on the front porch, young, hopeful, smiling at a future we couldn't yet see. On the back of the photo, Robert had written something in his familiar handwriting. A home is not measured by its value. It's measured by the love inside it. The words nearly brought me to tears, because somewhere along the way, people had started measuring my home differently. Not by memories, not by family, not by love, by dollar signs. And that realization broke my heart. The next morning, I received another unexpected call. It was David, my attorney. His voice sounded unusually serious. "Margaret, I need to see you. Is something wrong?" "Possibly." The word immediately caught my attention. "Possibly? Can you come by this afternoon?" I agreed. By 3 o'clock, I was sitting across from him once again. This time, however, there was no small talk. No polite conversation. David opened a folder and slid several papers across his desk. "These arrived yesterday." I examined them carefully. Then my blood ran cold. Someone had requested information regarding legal competency evaluations, not completed evaluations, not court filings, preparatory information, the first step toward a guardianship case. Exactly what Brian had warned me about. I looked up slowly. "Jennifer?" David nodded. "We can't prove intent, but based on timing and circumstances, I think you already know the answer." I closed my eyes briefly. Part of me had still hoped Brian was mistaken. Part of me had desperately wanted to believe there had been some misunderstanding. That hope disappeared in that moment. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. David folded his hands. "Margaret, I want to be very clear." I nodded. "You are fully competent." "Thank you." "No, I mean legally and medically." His expression remained firm. "No judge would look at your situation and determine otherwise." The reassurance helped, but it didn't solve the problem. Because the issue wasn't whether Jennifer would succeed. The issue was that she had been willing to try. That wound ran far deeper. As I prepared to leave, David handed me another document. "This is something you may want to consider." I looked down. A revised estate plan. I immediately understood. For the first time in my life, I began seriously considering changing my will. The thought felt surreal. Parents rarely imagine circumstances where they might need to protect themselves from their own children. Yet here I was, driving home with documents I never thought I would need. That evening brought another surprise. One I never could have anticipated. At approximately 7 o'clock, my doorbell rang. When I opened the door, Jennifer stood outside, alone. The moment I saw her face, I knew something had happened. She looked exhausted. Worse than exhausted. Terrified. Her eyes were red from crying. Mascara streaked her cheeks. Her hands trembled visibly. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered 2 words. "Can I?" I stepped aside. She entered slowly. For the first time in weeks, there was no confidence in her posture, no carefully rehearsed concern, no persuasive speeches, only fear, pure fear. We sat in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she had first suggested I leave my home, the same kitchen where decades of family memories had unfolded. For several moments, silence filled the room. Then she finally broke, completely. Tears poured down her face. Her shoulders shook. Years seemed to vanish instantly. Suddenly, she wasn't a 45-year-old woman. She was my little girl again, lost, scared, overwhelmed, and despite everything that had happened, seeing her cry still hurt me, because mothers never stop being mothers, no matter how badly their hearts have been broken. I messed up. The words came out barely above a whisper. I said nothing, she continued. I messed up so badly. For nearly an hour, Jennifer talked. Really talked. For the first time since this nightmare began. The story matched much of what Brian had already revealed. The debts, the pressure, the panic, the failed attempts to fix things. One poor decision leading to another, and another, and another, until eventually she felt trapped, cornered, desperate. At several points, she openly admitted things she had previously denied. The real estate research, the nursing home strategy, even discussions about guardianship. Each confession landed like another stone on my chest. Yet something else became increasingly clear. Jennifer wasn't sitting here because she had suddenly developed a conscience. She was sitting here because something had changed. Something had frightened her. Finally, I asked the question, "What happened?" Her expression immediately shifted. The color drained from her face. And suddenly I understood. This was the real reason she had come. Not guilt. Fear. Deep, overwhelming fear. Jennifer. She swallowed hard. What happened? For several seconds, she couldn't answer. Then she reached into her purse and handed me an envelope. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a letter. A demand notice. Formal. Aggressive. Threatening. The details made my stomach tighten. The debts had reached a breaking point. Legal action was imminent. Assets could be pursued. Accounts frozen. Property targeted. The situation was far worse than I had imagined. I looked up slowly. How long? Her eyes filled with fresh tears. Months. Months. She had been carrying this for months. And instead of asking for help, she had tried to take control. Tried to manipulate circumstances. Tried to solve the problem alone. The result had nearly destroyed our family. Jennifer buried her face in her hands. "I'm sorry." The words sounded genuine. Painfully genuine. I never meant for this to happen. I believed her. That was the hardest part. I believed she never intended to become this person. But intentions don't erase actions. And consequences remain, whether we welcome them or not. Eventually, she looked up, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to do anymore." For a long moment, I simply stared at her. Then I glanced toward the hallway, toward the framed photographs lining the walls, toward decades of memories, toward the life Robert and I had built. And suddenly I knew exactly what needed to happen. Not because it would be easy, not because it would be painless, but because it was necessary. I folded the demand letter carefully and placed it on the table. Then I looked directly at my daughter, Jennifer. She met my eyes. For the first time in weeks, there were no lies between us. No manipulation, no hidden agenda, only truth. What I'm about to do will change everything. Her expression filled with uncertainty. "What do you mean?" I took a deep breath. Because the decision I had made would shock everyone. Jennifer, Brian, the creditors, even the rest of the family. Most of all, it would completely destroy the plan she had spent months trying to put into motion. And once I revealed it, there would be no going back. Not for any of us. The next chapter of this story was about to begin. And nobody, not even Jennifer, was prepared for the move I was about to make. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt clear. Not because the situation had improved, not because the pain had disappeared, but because I had finally made a decision. The uncertainty was over. The waiting was over. The wondering was over. Now it was time to act. I walked through the house slowly, pausing in each room. The living room where Robert and I spent countless evenings together. The kitchen, where family dinners stretched late into the night. The hallway, where Jennifer's childhood photographs still hung. Every corner reminded me of something important. This house had never been about money. Never. It was about memories, love, sacrifice, family. And perhaps that was exactly why everything had gone so wrong. Somewhere along the way, people stopped seeing what the house represented and started seeing what it was worth. That distinction changes everything. At 10 o'clock, I called David. By noon, I was sitting in his office. When I explained my decision, he stared at me for several seconds. Then he smiled. Not because he found the situation amusing, but because he understood exactly what I was trying to do. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Completely." He nodded. "Then let's begin." For the next several hours, paperwork covered the conference table. Documents were reviewed. Forms were signed. Arrangements were made. By the time I left his office, the future looked very different than it had 24 hours earlier. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long while. Control. Real control. Not over Jennifer. Not over the debt. Not over the past. Over my own future. 3 days later, I invited Jennifer and Brian to the house. Neither knew why. Neither knew what I had decided. And judging by their nervous expressions when they arrived, both expected the worst. I greeted them politely and led them into the living room. The atmosphere felt tense, almost formal. Nobody seemed comfortable. Finally, Jennifer broke the silence. "Mom?" I looked at her. "Yes? You said you made a decision." "I did." Her hands tightened around each other. I could see the anxiety written across her face. Brian looked equally worried. For several moments, I allowed the silence to linger. Not out of cruelty, but because some moments deserve weight. This was one of them. Then I reached for the folder resting on the coffee table, the same folder that contained every document David had prepared. Jennifer immediately recognized legal paperwork. Her face went pale. I handed her the first page. As she read, confusion replaced fear. Then surprise replaced confusion. Then complete disbelief. "Mom!" She looked up. "What is this?" I folded my hands calmly. "It means the house is no longer part of anyone's inheritance." The room became completely silent. Jennifer stared at me. Brian stared at me. Neither seemed capable of speaking. I continued. 3 days ago, I transferred the property into a protected family legacy trust. Their expressions remained frozen. So I explained. The house could no longer be sold by anyone hoping to access quick money. It could no longer become the target of financial desperation. It could no longer become the center of family conflict. Most importantly, it would remain exactly what Robert and I intended it to be. A home, not an asset. Not a bargaining chip. Not a solution to someone's debt. A home. Jennifer looked down at the papers again, then back at me. You gave it away?" I smiled gently. "No, I don't understand. I protected it." Tears immediately filled her eyes, because in that moment, she finally understood. The opportunity she had been chasing no longer existed. The house was off the table, permanently. Yet something unexpected happened. Instead of becoming angry, Jennifer started crying. Not the fearful crying I had seen a few nights earlier. Not the desperate crying of someone cornered by debt. This was different. These were tears of realization. The kind that appear when someone finally sees the damage they've caused. "I don't deserve this family." Her voice cracked. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." The room fell quiet again. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I saw something beyond the mistakes. Beyond the manipulation. Beyond the poor decisions. I saw regret. Genuine regret. The kind that can't be faked. The kind that changes people. Slowly I moved to the chair beside her. Then I took her hand. The same hand I had held when she learned to walk. The same hand I had held during childhood fevers and teenage heartbreaks. The same hand I never thought would one day become the source of so much pain. "Jennifer." She couldn't meet my eyes. "Look at me." Eventually she did. "I am disappointed." Fresh tears appeared. "I know. I am hurt." She nodded. "I know. But you are still my daughter." At those words, she completely broke down. Years of pride disappeared. Months of deception collapsed. Every defense she had built simply vanished. For a long time, nobody spoke. There was nothing left to say. Only truths that needed to be felt. Eventually, Brian cleared his throat. "What happens now?" It was a fair question. The debt still existed. The problems hadn't magically disappeared. Life rarely works that way. I looked at both of them. Then I answered honestly. "Now you face the consequences." Neither argued. Neither complained. Because they knew I was right. I wasn't going to write a check that erased every mistake. I wasn't going to sacrifice my future to rescue them from theirs. Some lessons must be learned the hard way. Some responsibilities cannot be transferred. What I would offer was guidance, support, love, but not rescue. Never rescue. Over the following months, Jennifer and Brian began rebuilding their lives. It wasn't easy. There were sacrifices, budget cuts, extra jobs, painful conversations, hard choices, exactly the kind of choices they should have made from the beginning. Little by little, progress came. Not quickly, not dramatically, but honestly, and that made all the difference. As for me, I stayed right where I belonged, in my home, the same blue house on Maple Street, the same porch where Robert and I once sat watching sunsets. the same garden filled with flowers and memories. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed, because I had learned something important. Growing older does not mean surrendering your voice. It does not mean handing over your choices. It does not mean becoming invisible. Age does not erase wisdom. If anything, it strengthens it. 1 year later, Jennifer visited for Sunday dinner. A real visit. Not an agenda. Not a strategy. Not a sales pitch disguised as concern. Just family. After dessert, she followed me onto the porch. The evening sun painted the neighborhood gold. For a while, we sat quietly. Then she spoke. "You know something?" "What?" She smiled through misty eyes. "The day you protected this house," she paused, "I thought I'd lost everything." I turned toward her. "And?" She squeezed my hand. "It turns out I got my mother back." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. We simply watched the sunset. And in that moment, I realized something beautiful. The move my daughter never expected wasn't legal. It wasn't financial. It wasn't even strategic. The move she never expected was this. I chose strength without revenge, boundaries without bitterness, wisdom without cruelty. I protected my future without destroying hers. And in the end, that decision saved something far more valuable than a house. It saved a family. Because houses can be rebuilt. Money can be earned again. But when love survives betrayal and still finds a way forward, that is a wealth no one can ever take away. And that, more than any property, investment, or inheritance, became the legacy I chose to leave behind.